Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm the GCSE science teacher. In today's video, we're going to be learning about different genetic disorders for GCSE biology. This is all the different disorders that are part of the AQA, OCR and Edexcel course. So I wanted to include all of them here, especially for those of you who are doing triple science or are thinking about doing A-levels, where a lot of the content is application based. So it's really important to know a wide variety of different conditions anyway, regardless of the exam board you're studying for. I will leave the exam boards in the description box so you can check and see which ones that you need to know specifically for your exam. But I thought it'd be worth mentioning these are all the different conditions that I've found across the curriculum that really do have a good way of helping us understand genetics and, dominant, recessive, alleles, and all those different keywords we've talked about before. So yeah, I hope you guys do find this helpful. If you do, feel free to give the video a thumbs up. Do share this with someone, especially if you know of anyone who is revising. And of course, if you haven't already, please do subscribe and join this lovely community here on YouTube. So let's get started. The first thing I want to establish and help us understand is this idea of genetic disorders or genetic diseases or inherited conditions. All of that is referring to the same thing. Essentially, these are conditions where different alleles, whether dominant or recessive alleles, are essentially inherited from biological parents, and the offspring will either be a carrier, will be not affected at all, or will potentially have the condition itself, depending on the type of genetics that condition is associated with. It's worth mentioning, though, even though these are sometimes called diseases, they are not the same as those communicable diseases that we've talked about before. Remember, communicable diseases are ones that are easily transmitted or transferred to other organisms. So you can catch those diseases. These diseases you cannot catch. Someone is just born with this condition, and it can develop over time, definitely. And lifestyle factors can affect it potentially. But this is a condition that someone will have, and it's due to their genetics. So they're born with this, and they have the ability to then pass this on to their children in the future as well. So that's kind of the biggest thing to mention at this point. So some of those conditions we're going to talk about include cystic fibrosis, polydactyly, red-green colour blindness. We also have things like sickle cell anemia and other blood disorders like haemophilia. We're also going to talk about breast cancer and also Huntington's disease as well. So all of those, like I said, are covered in different exam boards. Some of them are across all of them. So yeah, if you do, like I said, have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comment section. I'll get back to you. So cystic fibrosis is the first type of condition we're going to talk about. And as I said, this is an inherited condition, meaning that there are alleles that are responsible for this condition. Specifically, the genes on chromosome 7 are affected, and the faulty genes on chromosome 7 is what causes this condition. So as this condition is a recessive disorder, that means two faulty alleles, one from mum, one from dad, need to be inherited for an individual to have cystic fibrosis. If someone just inherits one of those alleles, they actually have the dominant allele, which acts as a bit of a protective allele. So therefore, we know dominant essentially overrides recessive. It's more expressed than recessive is. You need two recessive alleles for the genotype to be expressed phenotypically. That just means that they're a carrier, so they have the potential to have a child themselves with cystic fibrosis. However, the person who actually has the condition would need two of those copies of those faulty alleles. So they'd need two alleles, like you see here, lowercase f, representing that homozygous recessive trait. If someone has no cystic fibrosis alleles, they would be classed as homozygous dominant, which is represented here by two capital Fs. Remember, the letters that I've chosen, like F, doesn't actually matter. You could use a different letter. It's absolutely fine. Just remember, we're looking for capital and lowercase letters to represent dominant and recessive, respectively. So what actually does cystic fibrosis look like? How does it present? Because we know that obviously two faulty alleles are needed. We know this occurs because of the genes on chromosome 7. Chromosome 7 is actually quite a common chromosome for a lot of conditions. We'll get onto that later. And we know that this condition, as a result, affects a lot of the cell membranes around the body, specifically the respiratory system. People who have cystic fibrosis, unfortunately, have a lot of problems with their respiratory breathing, respiratory system. They may need transplants later on in life. They might require a lot of medical interventions, respirators, things like that to help them breathe, because that buildup of mucus can actually cause a lot of blockages and infections and things like that. So it's not a particularly nice condition at all. And also because this condition affects cell membranes, as you can imagine, cell membranes are everywhere in the body. So it really does affect a lot of different aspects of the body, including the intestines and the pancreas and things like this. So like I said, the treatments for this or medical interventions like transplants. This can be, removing parts of the lungs, removing the lungs themselves, and using a new donor lung to actually improve the airways of that individual. Genetic engineering or gene therapy can also be used as well to reintroduce the correct allele, so that faulty allele is no longer in the body, and this can help as well. Gene therapy and genetic engineering is a whole topic in itself, and I'll definitely do a video on that because there's a lot of information with that one. So if you would like that video, do let me know, and I'll get onto that. But for the most part, this is the key information you need to know about cystic fibrosis. So the next condition is called polydactyly. And just like cystic fibrosis, we can actually do some medical interventions to see the likelihood of someone having this condition or having a child with this condition. In the case of cystic fibrosis, we can use the heel prick test after birth to check if that child has that condition. But also we can use Punnett square analysis, genetic counseling techniques like that to see if someone is likely to have a child with those conditions, and any of the ones I'm going to discuss today. And this is based on the family history and also the genes of those parents as well. So that's just something to consider at this point. So polydactyly, if we look at the etymology of this word and we break it down, poly means many and dactyly just refers to the digits, so our fingers and toes. So someone who has polydactyly will have extra fingers or extra toes or both. And this is actually because of a dominant allele that is inherited. So only one allele is needed. Now, this is expressed in the phenotype in this way, and therefore, because it's dominantly inherited, there are no carriers. There's no such thing in this case as a heterozygous carrier, because if you have a heterozygous carrier, remember you have one dominant, one recessive. But if you have the dominant allele, that person will have this condition of polydactyly. Someone who has two alleles, so they're homozygous dominant, again, they will have that condition as well. The only way the person doesn't have polydactyly is if they inherit two recessive alleles. Again, this affects the gene is affected on chromosome 7, which is actually a really interesting chromosome that researchers, scientists, medical professionals have looked into in a lot more detail because of conditions like this and cystic fibrosis. We kind of work backwards where we look at diseases first and then see what genes are affected or what chromosomes, and then that gives us an understanding of what those chromosomes and genes actually do. So chromosome 7 is often known as the chromosome to do with development and anatomy and things like that, so specific parts of the body. Now, it's interesting about this particular condition because it's, like I said, a dominant inheritance, but it's actually quite rare. So you don't often see people with more fingers and toes than default. But yeah, why is it rare? And the reason it's most likely rare is because the evolutionary advantage isn't necessarily there. Someone with extra fingers or toes might not have an evolutionary advantage over someone who has the default amount. And that is kind of why evolution hasn't pushed the whole human race to have more fingers and toes. That being said, people who have extra digits might have better functionality. But yeah, this hasn't been like a selective pressure that's kind of caused the whole species of humans to have this condition. So that's why it's kind of considered rare, but it is dominant as well. So it's kind of one of those exceptions. Usually we think about rare conditions being recessive conditions, but you don't want to fall into that misconception because this is a good example where that does not apply. So the next genetic condition we're going to talk about is red-green color blindness, otherwise known as deuteranopia. And this is referring to how we perceive colours, specifically red and green colours. So this is a condition that's actually considered sex-linked, or is found specifically on the sex chromosome, the X chromosome. Now, we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail with another condition as well, but sex-linked disorders are more likely going to affect men. And the reason for that is because men, as we know, only have one X chromosome and a Y chromosome as well. Women, however, have two X chromosomes. And this is kind of why women are often carriers, but men are often the ones who have the condition and express it, because they only have that one chromosome. With women, you have a second X chromosome, and often, therefore, you have the allele that is working, and therefore you can see all the colours in this case. So how does this actually work? If we look back at the eye, which I've done a video on, if you'd like me to link that, I will put that in the description or the cards or somewhere for you. But at the very back of the eye, we have some photo light receptive areas, if you will. So this is called the rods and cones, specifically the cones at the back of the eye where the retina is. That's the part that helps us to perceive different colours of light. So red, green and blue, and they're very sensitive to those different colours and wavelengths. However, someone with this condition of red-green colour blindness, they don't actually have that ability to easily distinguish between those shades of red and green. There's no cure for this, really. The things that people can do is to use coloured filters, maybe glasses, to help those colours stand out a bit more. Some people find that more confusing, so often people don't really do anything about this. And there are tests to see if people have this condition. There are like these little circles that have kind of lots of little coloured dots, and in the centre there's like a big number, and these can be used to see if someone has this condition or not. But for the most part, this doesn't really affect people massively, but obviously this can vary depending on person to person. So like I said, this is occurring on chromosome X. That's kind of the main bit you need to know about it. If we were to do a Punnett square, which you can see here, often they will use the kind of the setup I've drawn here. So I want to show you the Punnett square because often we just use one letter, but because it's an X-linked condition, they will actually in the exam and just generally, they'll have the X chromosome and then like a letter on top of it, kind of like you have in maths where you have like a square. That's what they're doing in this case. So if you see that, don't get worried or confused about it. It's just showing you the allele, but it's on the X chromosome. So I just wanted to show you that in case you didn't know. So for example, we've got the mum and the dad, we've got XX. The mum has the allele that's faulty, but they do not have the condition themselves because they've got another X chromosome. The parent, the father, has an X and Y chromosome, of course, as well. Now you can see that there's 4 offspring in blue that could essentially have the probability of having the red-green colour blindness. The women, one of them is a carrier, one of them is not. The men are more likely to have that condition. As you can see, I've circled the one that does have that faulty allele, and that's the only X chromosome that it has, and therefore, that's the one with the faulty allele, so therefore they will have the condition. So just thought I'd mention that in case you see this and you were unsure what those alleles meant. So hope that helps. So the next condition is sickle cell anemia, and the word sickle cell anemia actually tells us quite a lot about the condition itself. So this is a type of blood disorder, as the name anemia would suggest, and sickle cell refers to the shape of the red blood cell. This is a condition that affects quite a wide proportion of the population globally, and a lot of people are actually carriers for sickle cell anemia, and we'll get onto this later on in a moment. This is a recessive condition, so 2 copies of that faulty gene, those alleles, are needed for this condition to be expressed phenotypically. You can therefore have carriers, so someone could be heterozygous. They can have a dominant and a recessive allele for the gene HBB, and essentially that gene codes for a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, as we know, is found in red blood cells, and its job is to essentially have a high affinity for oxygen. It binds to oxygen and it transports that oxygen in the blood around to other cells for respiration, breaking down glucose to release energy, which is a really vital process for us because that energy can be used for so many different things. The thing is with someone with sickle cell anemia, however, is they have a couple of things that aren't necessarily advantageous in terms of the red blood cells. So for example, the biconcave shape that we usually see in red blood cells, they actually have more of a sickle shape. So the red blood cell physically looks different, which means that it has this crescent sickle shape, which means that it doesn't have the ability to carry as much oxygen as a biconcave shaped red blood cell does. And that means that someone has potentially a shorter lifespan because they're not getting as much oxygen around the body to the cells, and therefore releasing enough energy from that glucose. It's not as efficient in a process of respiration. So that's one of the things this condition is, associated with. The other thing as well is the red blood cells themselves. Usually, red blood cells have a lifespan of around 120 days. Sickle cell anemia individuals, their red blood cells have a much shorter lifespan, around 10 to 20 days. So that is why the word anemia is associated with this condition. Anemia essentially is a condition where there is a lower red blood cell count. Remember, blood is made up of loads of different components. So we have platelets to help with clotting, plasma to, has the urea and the carbon dioxide, the waste products. The red blood cells, like I said, transport that oxygen around the body. And we also have as well our white blood cells for the immune system, amongst other things as well, like water, etc. But yeah, those red blood cells, they don't have the longer lifespan that a usual red blood cell would, and therefore this leads to that anemic condition as well. So, like I said, those are some key differences. Also, because of that sickle shape as well, because the red blood cell shape is specifically differently shaped, it can cause some blockages in the capillaries, arteries, veins, and this can cause conditions like a heart attack or stroke. So there's a higher risk of that in people who have this condition. Now, like I said, a lot of people actually are carriers for this condition. A lot of people, specifically of certain backgrounds, such as Caribbean backgrounds, African backgrounds, are more affected by this condition. And the reason for this is because there is actually an advantage to this condition. It actually means that people who have this condition, or even just the carriers of this condition, have a protection against certain conditions like malaria because of the red blood cell shape. And this has actually, because of that, has actually led to a positive selection pressure for this particular mutation of the gene, especially in those areas where malaria is highly prevalent because of the climate there. So there is a protective mechanism why this has been pushed, like I said, because it is a recessive condition, but it is in a high prevalence. There's quite a lot of people who have this condition. And the reason is because of that positive selection pressure to help people survive in those climates and those areas, who are particularly prone to malaria outbreaks. So that's the thing with genetics. A lot of it is pushed through evolutionary advantage, and this is a good example of that. So yeah, how do we treat this? So some people may require bone marrow transplants. There are risks obviously associated with this. Any transplant, anything that's put foreign into the body can have a rejection. But bone marrow transplants are really good because that's where our red blood cells are essentially manufactured from, those stem cells. But this can be really revolutionary and life-changing to someone who has this condition. And obviously as well, genetic counselling can be done to try and see the probability of someone having a child with this condition as well. And then obviously those discussions can occur and people can make informed decisions and choices. So there's lots of things that can be done. And those are the key things you need to know for GCSE. So the next condition we're going to talk about is haemophilia, and this is very similar to the red-green colour blindness because this is actually a sex-linked condition. It affects chromosome X, or the genes that are on chromosome X. Some of the alleles are faulty there, and this leads to this condition, which essentially someone who has this is unable to produce clotting factors or proteins. Remember, DNA codes for proteins essentially, and those proteins, those clotting factors, are really necessary to help heal wounds and to stop the blood just, being released from the body. Which of course can be really dangerous, harmful and fatal, especially if there's internal bleeding and things like that. So someone who has this condition has to be really mindful and careful and manage it throughout their life, because unfortunately there's no cure. There are treatments, however, and someone can inject themselves with clotting factors to help the blood clot, but often things like contact sports are avoided to prevent things like unnecessary injuries that can lead to complications. So because this is a sex-linked condition, this is more likely affecting men. Women can obviously get this, but more men as opposed to women often are the people who have this. And this is again because there is only one X chromosome in males, whereas women have two X chromosomes. So as you can see again in the Punnett square, this is the sort of thing you'd see. The one I've circled there, this is the individual who has the condition. Some people are carriers, like the one above it. That's a woman who has the faulty allele, but they have an X chromosome that has no faulty allele. And of course, some men and women in this Punnett square, you can see, do not have the condition at all. So yeah, it's something that they link nicely to Punnett square analysis, which we've done in a previous video, like I said. So it's worth just trying to link those ideas together when you are doing your revision as well. So breast cancer is another genetic condition we're going to talk about, and you need to know a bit of detail about. It's actually a dominant condition, meaning only one of those inherited for breast cancer to develop in an individual. And this is an inherited mutation of two different genes, either BRCA1 or BRCA2 or both. And these genes are found on chromosome 17 in the case of BRCA1 and chromosome 13 in the case of BRCA2. Now, what do these genes do? Like I said, scientists will often work backwards. So they'll use the disease to basically tell us what those genes do, as opposed to knowing what the genes do and then finding out that it causes a disease if it's mutated. So what does BRCA1 and BRCA2 actually do? Well, BRCA1 has the ability to repair DNA, and this helps with the cell cycle. So when DNA is mutated, BRCA1 genes actually go back and help that DNA from being mutated, and it can help with preventing cells becoming cancerous. Now, the thing is with that, if that gene that has the ability to prevent cancer gets mutated, then there is no checkpoint to make sure that future cells are being checked, and therefore this can cause cancer to occur. The same with BRCA2. BRCA2 is a gene that essentially provides instructions to make proteins that act as tumor suppressors, which means the word suppressor just means to stop something from happening. So it's a tumor suppressor gene, so it stops tumors from developing. But if BRCA2, which is involved in tumor suppression, is mutated, then again, this leads to more tumors forming. So both of these genes have a direct impact in preventing cancer, but if they are essentially mutated, this can lead to cancer, if that makes sense. So both of these genes are super important in actually stopping cancer from occurring in the body, but because they're mutated, they actually now help cancer form more rapidly. So it's a very very interesting topic, as you can imagine. And when scientists found this out, obviously BRCA1, BRCA2 genes are now screened for. People can actually see if they can have this, test to see if they're more likely to get cancer, specifically breast cancer, because of the huge impacts these genes actually have. We can actually check to see if someone has inherited them. So what do we do if someone has? What's the plan there? So surgery can be done to remove any tumorous tissue. Chemotherapy, of course, and radiotherapy can be used as treatment methods as well. Like I said, genetic testing can be done to see if offspring or children are likely to inherit these genes as well. And again, people who have this condition also have high risks of other cancers as well, especially if it's caught later on through metastasis. I would highly recommend that video I did on cancer, because that does link nicely to this, and it will give you a bit more information as well. So I'll link that for you. So the final condition we're going to talk about is one called Huntington's disorder, and this is caused by a dominant allele that is inherited, and therefore, of course, only one allele is needed for this condition to be phenotypically expressed. It's actually a very progressive and incurable condition. So often people who have this condition, they don't actually know they do until later on in life, and often by that point they've had children themselves. So it's one of those conditions that, like I said, only really shows and is expressed later on in the form of tremors, clumsiness, mood changes, memory loss, difficulty concentrating. Often these can be considered as other things as well. So often that diagnosis is much later on in life as well. And like I said, because it's incurable, there are ethical considerations around this. Should we tell people they have this condition or this disorder and then be like, okay, well, you now know, but there's nothing we can do about it? That's not very ethical or morally correct. We shouldn't really do that. And that's why a lot of people would rather not know as well if they do have this condition. Something else to mention as well in this case, it's considered a neurodegenerative disease, which is what causes those symptoms that I've described, like memory loss, mood changes, that kind of thing. And it's because essentially the nervous tissue in the brain, for example, is broken down, or the synapses are lost over time. There's a lot of damage to nerves that kind of causes this disease to occur. So those are the sorts of things you need to know at GCSE about this condition itself. Okay, and that is it from me today. I've been the GCSE science teacher and you have been curious. I hope you did find this video helpful and you learned something new. If you have any questions, by all means, feel free to comment them down below in the comment section and I'll get back to you. If you'd like some more videos like this, maybe you want to revise biology, chemistry, or physics, I have lots of videos on my channel and I'll link some here for you. Those videos I mentioned throughout the video as well, I'll link in the description box for you guys. If you'd like more content, maybe out of YouTube, I have an Instagram and TikTok. Everything is at the GCSE Science Teacher. And yeah, I hope you find this helpful. Let me know if you have any video requests and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.